Hey folks, George here. This time I'm going to give a series of discussions on the philosophy of law and how we might explore and examine and analyze some of the key questions and ideas within the realm of philosophy of law. Now, the key thing that's going to come up, or I hope the first question that you ask that's going to come up is going to be, what is philosophy of law? Now, to be sure, it's not quite law. It is essentially philosophy. So what makes philosophy different from law? Well, I'm not quite sure. I think if you ask 10 different philosophers this question, you'll probably get 11 or 12 different answers, actually. But here's at least a sort of summation about what philosophy makes, right? Or what philosophy does. I think that this is just me, since I'm giving these discussions. I can only give you my perspective on this. I'll try to give other perspectives too, but one key thing that I see as the role of philosophy is that we ask questions. We ask complicated questions and more foundational questions, as opposed to the more concrete questions. Now, without doubt, philosophers of law do want to ask some of these more application questions too. For example, applied philosophy of law. What does philosophy suggest about, let's say, the death penalty or affirmative action or equal rights, right? And I think those are brilliant questions. Unfortunately, I only have limited time here, so I don't think I'm going to delve too deeply into applied philosophy of law, asking specific questions about the justice of, let's say, the death penalty or equal protection under the law or other sorts of things like this. Rather, I want to ask the more abstract questions. And in this series, we're going to ask the more abstract questions about philosophy of law. Well, I'm going to break this up into three main categories for philosophy of law. And this has roots in more traditional philosophy, right? The first category that I'm going to break this up into is more metaphysical or ontological kinds of questions, more foundational questions like, what is the law? What is the nature of the law? What is the status of the law? What are standards of law? And what's the difference between rule of law and rule of men? Right? Now, this is going to, these are not three very nicely neat categories. I'm just categorizing them in a very sloppy way, so you'll forgive me, I hope. I think you can find smarter philosophers than I who will say, wait a second, that isn't a nice, clean demarcation. Okay, fair enough, I admit. However, this helps me think and helps me categorize some of the questions that we're going to ask, and it's helpful for me. The second category is going to be more epistemological questions. And what are epistemological questions? Well, epistemology is ultimately about the theory of knowledge, philosophy of knowledge. What is knowledge? So here the question is going to be, how do we know what the law is? And this is going to be very complicated. I think that many people might take it for granted what the law is. But we'll see many complicated cases in the history of law that suggests that it's not as clear-cut as we might initially think. So how do we really know about the law? And then, of course, the third category, which might be more fun for a lot of us, is going to be more questions about morals and ethics and the law. Those are going to be questions like, what should the law be? You see, that's distinct from what is the law, the more metaphysical, ontological question, what is the law, versus the ethical question, what should the law be? Right? How should the law work? How should the law be implemented? A lot of these should questions are going to go in there. We're going to sneak in a lot of these should questions with moral and ethical sorts of questions about the law. How is morality related to the law? That's going to be a very deep question here too, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that even with this first introductory lecture right now, right? And what is the relationship between morality and law? And different philosophers are going to have radically different questions about that, right? To be sure, I am taking this elitist sort of position, aren't I? That philosophers ask very deep questions, more deep questions than typical practitioners of law. Let's call them lawyers and judges. But that's a terrible oversimplification and terrible overgeneralization on my part, right? Because I think lawyers and judges and jurists do ask these foundational questions, and they have to ask these foundational questions. I think that sometimes, however, many practitioners of the law, that is judges, lawyers, and the rest, have assumptions about what the law is about. For example, that first question, what is the law? Well, somebody might just say what the law is simply what's written down. Well, we're going to examine through the course of these discussions here that that's not always the case, according to some folks. And even further, we're going to examine, wait, what if the law is simply what's written down? Is what's written down always clear, right? And so how do we wrestle with these deeper, more foundational questions about what is the law? Some philosophers are going to say, and some lawyers and jurists are going to say, the law is merely what the original intent of the legislators who wrote the law is. And some philosophers are going to say things like, well, that can't be because they wrote the law in such an abstract manner. So how do we really understand that? And that's why philosophy of law is really delving into some of those more complicated questions. Now, certainly lawyers and jurists and judges do deal with other types of complicated questions very frequently, especially in terms of how to apply the law. And philosophers are going to try to play into that too. With these series of discussions that I'm going to have, we'll see how different ideas do apply the law in different ways. To be sure, this series on the philosophy of law is not, I'm not going to talk too much about ethics and moral philosophy, right? There is another sort of series of discussions that I do want to make on ethics and moral philosophy, but I don't have those done just yet. Right here, we're going to talk about mostly philosophy of law. Now, we will have to understand a little bit about ethics to see how we might want to apply the law sometimes, right? So I'm not going to give the best introduction right now on two key moral philosophies, but it'll help us at least get the wheels turning so that we can start jumping in and start thinking about what really is important to us when we talk about the law, when we talk about philosophy, when we talk about ethics, when we talk about what governments should and shouldn't do, or what governments do have the power to do and what they don't have the power to do over us. So we see already right there that philosophy of law is really an intersection and is going to borrow from a lot of different other philosophical fields, such as ethics and morals. Certainly I've already discussed that, but also political philosophy and what are governments and what should governments have the power to do. And I've already discussed a little bit about epistemology and a little bit about metaphysics and ontology as well. But right now I want to give just the briefest discussion on moral philosophy. And I'll just talk about two key moral theories right here. The first is going to be utilitarianism, and then we'll talk a little bit about deontological ethics. The first key thinkers of utilitarianism, the biggest key thinkers of utilitarian ethics, are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And ultimately they can be boiled down into one key idea. Utilitarianism, that is, and utilitarian ethics can be boiled down to one key idea, and that key idea is the good action is the one that produces the greatest amount of good, right? If you have to decide between two different actions, the better action, the more moral action, the more ethical action is the one that produces the greatest amount of good. The parallel to that, of course, is that a good moral action is the one that decreases pain, because pain, of course, is bad. And we're not going to get into the arguments for that right now. The detailed arguments, will just take those assumptions for what they are at this point, right? So we want the least amount of bad, or the least amount of pain, and the greatest amount of happiness, or the greatest amount of good. Of course, the challenges of this are we have to predict the future. And the utilitarians are very well aware that predicting the future isn't always our strong suit. But we have to do the best we can. Yes, that is, when I take a cake to somebody, of course I'm producing their amount of happiness, let's say. However, if you consider down the line, aren't there complications? And this is going to be one of the key problems that I see with utilitarian ethics, is what about if this piece of cake and this person can't quite deal with sugar in the proper way. That is, they're diabetic, or they generate diabetes because they're eating too many sweets. Well, that would be a bad action, wouldn't it? So we have to weigh these sorts of things, and that makes things quite complicated, because I'm not sure, am I causing this person to have diabetes with this piece of cake, or am I causing this person to enjoy her birthday, right? Because she likes sweet desserts. That's going to be a complicated thing. The other objection with utilitarian ethics is, it seems like, and we'll talk about this perhaps in a little bit, it seems like it might demand too much of us. A key contemporary utilitarian thinker is Peter Singer, and he's written a lot about global poverty, because there are people around this world who are terribly impoverished, living under $2 a day, basically. And these people are starving to death every day. And what Peter Singer suggests as a utilitarian, well, in order for us to decrease their amount of suffering, we should be giving them a whole lot, right? Now, how much should we give them? Well, being a utilitarian, we should give them almost as much until we're almost starving, right? Now, I've got this camera that I'm filming this on. I've got a microphone on top of the camera. I've got these lights that are lighting me. Clearly, I'm not living up to that utilitarian standard according to Peter Singer, right? Is that too demanding, right? And the fact that you're probably watching this on a computer right now, or some sort of device that lets you search the web, right? Doesn't that show that you're probably not living up to Peter Singer's utilitarian standard too? So some people do suggest that utilitarianism is too demanding, right? A third problem with utilitarianism is that it seems like it might lead to intuitively wrong decisions sometimes. That is, hey, in order to produce the greatest amount of good, doesn't that entail that sometimes we have to sacrifice people? I could imagine all sorts of crazy scenarios where that might be appropriate, where a utilitarian would say, well, in order for the most good to be spread, somebody will have to suffer. And let's say we make a slave out of one person in order to serve, let's say, 1,000 people's happiness. That seems like it's intuitively wrong, according to many people. Therefore, doesn't that show that something's wrong, or fishy at least, with utilitarianism, right? So that's going to be a complication with utilitarianism, although many people like Peter Singer are going to try to wrestle with that question and wrestle with those problems and still try to illustrate how utilitarianism is the most beneficial ethical philosophy. Now let's move on to a competing ethical philosophy, deontological ethics. The key deontological ethicists is going to be Immanuel Kant. There are others, of course, as well before him, including Aquinas, especially. But Immanuel Kant really, when we study deontological ethics today, is going to be the philosopher that we're really focusing on, and that many scholars today will focus upon too, and try to fix his problems or try to improve his philosophy, right? So the key idea with deontological ethics is that we all have moral duties and obligations. Deontological ethics means duty ethics, right? We do have duties as human beings. And whether the consequences are good or bad don't matter. What matters is that I perform my duty, right? Now, some people can already see some sort of problem with that, I hope. So we'll see how deontological ethicists might have to deal with some of those problems. Of course, deontological ethics has nothing to do with happiness or pleasure or pain, because, by the way, I know my duties sometimes, and they cause me a great deal of pain. They do not make me happy to perform my duties. And somebody like Kant is going to say it doesn't matter. You have to do your duty, even though it hurts you, of course, right? That's what makes it a duty and an obligation to others. How do we know what our duties are? Well, we simply use reason, right? And the key idea for Immanuel Kant is the categorical imperative. If we simply use reason, we can figure out what our duty is, utilizing this categorical imperative. And the categorical imperative ultimately says, our duties are those maxims which we can universalize, right? A nicer way of rewording that might be, what if everybody did this, right? What if everybody did this? And so his classic example is lying. Could you imagine if everybody lied, right? Can we universalize lying? And of course, the answer is going to be no, because then communication would be impossible, right? The very act of talking, the act of lying would not make sense anymore. It would logically fall apart if you universalize lying. Therefore, Kant is going to say clearly we have a duty to never lie. And that's going to be a key problem for deontological ethics, is they're very absolutist with their ethical principles, right? Our duties are our duties. You shall never lie. Not even white lies, never lie, Immanuel Kant would say, right? And never do the wrong thing. You never do the wrong thing, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the consequences. And that's why some people have a significant problem with that kind of philosophy. Another imperative of deontological ethics, according to Kant, is that each individual, each person is an ends into themselves. We shall never treat a person as a means to something else, right? And that's why it's going to be easy to understand why slavery should be wrong under deontological ethics. You shall never use a person as a means only, right? Because each person is valuable in and of herself. Well, some people might say, yeah, but don't I use employees, right? If I hire an employee, aren't I using that employee? And Kant would say, no way. Here's why: because you pay that employee. Furthermore, employees can quit, right? Employees can quit, and you are paying the employee, and the employee agrees to work with you or not. Whereas slavery would not be allowed under a deontological ethics, because that would merely treat them as merely a means, right? As opposed to a person in and of herself, for example, right? That means everybody's got rights as a autonomous person. And that's where utilitarian ethics is going to break from deontological ethics, because under utilitarian ethics, not everybody has rights necessarily, right? We can sacrifice some rights for the greater good. Deontological ethics will say never sacrifice rights. Remember, it's very absolutist, deontological ethics, right? So we're going to have to always respect people's rights, respect people's fundamental rights. Yeah. Some problems, of course, with deontological ethics then are that many people think that it's way too absolute, right? The classic example is, what if a serial killer comes to your door and says, hey, is that person in your bedroom? Are you hiding this person? Kant would, of course, say, never lie. So if you are hiding the person that some serial killer wants to murder, you're not supposed to lie to a serial killer? Well, Kant is very absolute in this way, and that seems very abstract, and it seems very unrealistic in the real world, right? Also, this doesn't seem to account for other sorts of very important moral considerations, such as relationships. That is, if I'm supposed to treat everybody as an ends in themselves, doesn't that mean I should treat everybody equally? Except you'll forgive me, I love my mother a lot more than I love your mother, right? And I'm going to treat my mother a lot differently than I treat your mother. So doesn't that sort of squeeze things slightly differently for not accounting for such relationships? By the way, I think this might be a problem with utilitarian ethics too. We'll talk about that perhaps in a future discussion. And another big problem with deontological ethics is there's very little guidelines as to when rights conflict, right? When rights conflict. What about my right to, let's say, freedom of movement versus right to my own private property to trespass, right? And disallow trespassing over my private property. It seems like there are conflicts. How does Kant deal with those conflicts? Why shall my rights to private property overweigh rights to movement and personal movement over my own body, right? It's going to be a complicated problem. Of course, deontological ethicists want to deal with those problems and try to come up with solutions to those problems. Now, The key textbook and series of texts that I'm going to focus upon through this series of discussions is David Adams' Philosophical Problems in the Law. Full disclosure, I studied under David Adams at Cal Poly Pomona. During my undergrad years, I studied this course with him. And of course, since then, though, I've learned a whole lot more about philosophy. My goodness, that was way back in the 1900s when I studied with David Adams. I think one interesting case that he gives to us in this very brief introduction is this case of an overloaded lifeboat, right? And he gives us this so that you and I can try to start thinking about philosophical problems about how to apply the law, does it say, what is the law actually in this case, and things like this. So let's let's share some ideas about this fictional scenario. There is a boat that's got passengers and it hits a terrible storm. The boat has sunk and some passengers and crew have drowned, including the captain. Now, there are 23 passengers and crew who found a lifeboat and got on this lifeboat. Here's a key thing. The lifeboat fits 20 comfortably. Presumably there's a sticker on the lifeboat or something like that. The lifeboat fits 20 comfortably and 24 without danger. But each additional person after 24 significantly increases the risk of capsizing the boat or sinking the boat, the lifeboat. Some swimmers, after the 23 passengers and crew already got onto the lifeboat, some swimmers swam up to the boat, right? Swam up to the lifeboat. The first mate, since the captain has drowned, the first mate is now in charge. The first mate brought aboard the strongest person who was swimming up to the lifeboat. Now they're up to 24 people on the boat, right? On the lifeboat. And he pushed away the other swimmers. They didn't get on the boat, let's say, and he merely pushed them away and did not let them get on the boat. They all drowned. There were 5 such people. The lifeboat floats around for some time and is found by the Coast Guard, and all 24 people are rescued. However, the first mate and the crew are charged with 6 counts of murder. 5 people died. However, one of those people was a woman who was pregnant. And so they're charging that 6th count of murder for the unborn child. The case before us then is, shall these people be convicted of a crime? That is, these 6 counts of murder. Here's the important case law that we shall have to consider here. Murder, there's a definition here. Murder is the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. That is, they have the intent to kill. There's another key point that we have to consider in the case law. There is a historical precedent in these sorts of cases. There is a case of U.S. versus Holmes from 1842, where there is a similar situation, right? Holmes, in 1842, threw overboard several passengers on a lifeboat that was sinking. These people were already on the lifeboat. He threw them over in order to save the lifeboat. Holmes was convicted, arguing that 2 things. 1, that passengers shall have priority over the crew. And 2, if you are going to throw over people, we should draw lots. Neither of those criteria were met, right? He threw over a passenger, not a member of the crew, and there were not lots drawn, meaning that it wasn't completely random who was sacrificed to the sea. And because Holmes didn't follow either principle, Holmes was convicted of murder. So here's going to be a question that we've got to ask now. Number 1, back to our case. Is the first mate and the crew guilty of murder? That is, intentional murder with malice aforethought, unlawful killing of a human being. That's an interesting question, isn't it? One question that might come up with that question is, did the first mate and the crew, did they kill the people that were in the water by pushing them off and not letting them get on the boat? Or did they merely let them die? That's going to be a deep philosophical question that many philosophers wrestle with very frequently, especially in ethics. What is the difference between killing somebody and merely letting them die? To be sure, some philosophers think that there's a big difference. Some philosophers think there isn't so much of a difference, right? What do you think? The other question that comes up is the precedent that's established with the Holmes case. When we talk about precedent in the law, and stare decisis is the principle, is the Latin term for the principle of respecting precedent, how relevant is that Holmes case to our present case of this first mate who pushes people off the boat and keeps them from coming on? Well, one key difference, of course, is the fact that Holmes threw somebody off the boat, whereas this first mate in our case didn't let the person come on, so he didn't technically throw them off the boat, but aren't you kind of pushing them off the boat? How relevant is that difference, right? The other thing that's interesting is that that case of precedent, Holmes, gives us the idea that crews should sacrifice themselves first and passengers should have precedent. So should he have rescued all the crew first or made sure that passengers were all on board the lifeboat first? That's an interesting question. The other question would be that in our case, right, the first mate clearly picked the strongest person on the boat to pull on the boat, on the lifeboat. In the Holmes case, the suggestion was that such sort of decisions should be decided by lots at a completely random scale or with a completely random method. He certainly picked the strongest person. How shall we consider that? Right? Another thing that's interesting to me, of course, is the fact that Holmes' boat was sinking. This boat wasn't yet sinking. This boat was not yet sinking. There was presumably some sort of sticker that says anybody over 24 is going to greatly increase the risk of sinking. But in our case, the boat wasn't yet sinking and he was already pushing people away. I think that David Adams is quite sharp in giving us this case and giving us this scenario. Why? Because it helps our philosophical wheels start turning. And we can start thinking about what is interesting, what is important to consider. How do we ask questions? What questions should we be asking regarding what is the just thing to do? What is justice in this case? Of course, that's a very loaded term too that we will examine throughout the series of these discussions as well. What is justice? What is the law in this case? Yeah, I don't know. What do you all think about this case? I don't want to share my ideas just yet, but we see how many complicated issues there really are. How might utilitarian ethics influence our thinking on this case? How might deontological ethics influence our thinking about this case? Very curious questions. Very interesting questions. I'm excited to see what you all have in mind, yeah? See you next time. Bye-bye.